Hello everyone, and welcome to After Alexander. Episode 69, The First Century. A 100 years is a long time, and yet that's how long our narrative has now roughly covered. As we leave Seleucus III breathing his last in the summer of 223, it's been a century since the man he might have claimed to be his ancestor, Alexander the Great, also died. So, let's go back over what we discussed in the previous 68 episodes. To some extent, this is a memory test for me, although backed up in some places by my old transcript where my memory got a bit fuzzy. Just a warning, I'm not going to be diving back in with a lot of detail, and I will probably skip over some salient facts, as otherwise we will never get anywhere. With that in mind, let's take a time machine back to June of 323 BCE. Alexander III of Macedon died in the city of Babylon after having conquered the Persian Empire. When he died, he still had plans which were not carried out. These plans included to move people between Europe and Asia in order to mix the subjects of his new empire and unite them, conquering Carthage, and building a mausoleum for Philip II that was to rival the pyramids in terms of greatness. Once Alexander was gone, these projects were quickly shelved. He left behind him no real plan for what was to happen. His wife Roxana was pregnant, and he had a half-brother who seems to have been mentally handicapped in some way. After a bit of a power struggle within the army, it was eventually agreed that the king's brother and his eventual son would rule jointly. Thus, skipping over some detail, we eventually get the joint rule of Philip III and Alexander IV. A man named Perdiccas, whom Alexander had given his signet ring to on his deathbed, became the regent. He married Alexander's full sister Cleopatra, which was seen as a potential threat by the other successors to Alexander. After all, Alexander's father Philip II had used marriage into the royal family to usurp his nephew Amyntas IV and make himself king. This left the distinct possibility that Perdiccas could be planning to place the crown on his own head. Eventually, the First War of the Successors broke out, with Ptolemy against Perdiccas being the main story. Perdiccas marched against the satrap Ptolemy, who would eventually present himself as Alexander's paternal half-brother. He had been given control of Egypt and the division of responsibilities in the empire. Ptolemy had stolen Alexander's body on its way westwards and eventually buried it in Alexandria. This was a huge PR win for Ptolemy, but something Perdiccas would be unable to tolerate. Perdiccas attempted to cross the Nile River during his campaign, but failed disastrously. In the end, he was assassinated by some of his own subordinates, including our protagonist Seleucus. In the wake of Perdiccas' death, Ptolemy was offered the regency of the entire empire. He declined in favour of keeping control of his rich little slice of the imperial pie, and I can't say that I particularly blame him. Ultimately, an older man called Antipater was declared regent. When Antipater died, his son Cassander expected to be his heir. However, a man called Polyperchon became regent instead, something Cassander was none too pleased with. This would eventually result in the Second War of the Successors, which we won't really get into here. At this point, we should talk more about Seleucus. He had been awarded governance of Babylon following something called the Conference of Triparadisus in 320 BCE. However, he was eventually muscled out by a man called Antigonus and forced to flee to Egypt, where his friend Ptolemy was residing. For context, Antigonus had previously been in charge of fighting against one of Perdiccas' loyalists called Eumenes, who fled east and negotiated with Seleucus to try and get passage through his lands. After Eumenes was dealt with, Antigonus increasingly tried to muscle into the region, which saw the two of them butting heads, and Seleucus eventually fleeing to Egypt fearing for his life. After the Third War of the Successors kicked off, Ptolemy defeated Antigonus, the new strongman, badly enough that Seleucus could think about returning to his new home. He re-entered Babylon in 312 BCE, thereby kicking off the Seleucid era. Over the next few years, while Antigonus was focused on the west, Seleucus gobbled up the eastern satrapies, and even made it as far as India. He agreed his eastern border with the nascent Mauryan Empire under Chandragupta. You might have noticed that we haven't really talked about the kings at all, and you'd be right. First the kings, and then the regents, had become all but figureheads as the increasingly independent satraps jockeyed for position. Philip III would be murdered along with his niece-wife on the orders of Alexander IV's grandmother, Olympias. However, Cassander eventually had both Alexander IV and his grandmother killed off, as Alexander was getting a bit too close to maturity, and thereby power, for comfort. In 306 BCE, Antigonus declared himself king. This was rapidly followed by the other satraps, including Seleucus, as nobody wanted to be left out. Not that the satraps would have necessarily considered themselves part of separate states yet, but we can essentially say at this point that the Macedonian Empire is dead. War eventually broke out again, as it was wont to do, and Antigonus I was defeated and killed at Ipsus in 301 BCE. Antigonus had been pushing against Lysimachus, but Seleucus and his young son Antiochus had pushed madly to get their army and elephants, the latter courtesy of Chandragupta, to face Antigonus. Antigonus died, and the other successors gobbled up his lands. Seleucus got himself a western seaboard and was now considered the biggest threat to the other successors. Eventually, Seleucus fought against Lysimachus and took over his kingdom. For the first time in decades, he crossed over the Bosporus and back into Macedon, only now as its ruler. He was, at this point in time, the last general of Alexander still left standing. Even Ptolemy had died of natural causes at the age of 84, which is an impressive feat. Seleucus was, therefore, the last of a generation. Not that he would remain that way for long, as he was assassinated by Ptolemy the Thunderbolt. This man was the son of Ptolemy I and the elder half-brother of Ptolemy II. His presence in the Seleucid court would have given Seleucus an excuse to invade Egypt, and possibly restore the Macedonian Empire in its entirety. Now, Seleucus was gone. He left his throne to his son Antiochus by his wife Apama. Seleucus and Apama had been married at the mass weddings of Susa in 324 BCE, where Alexander tried to create a hybrid Persian-Macedonian ruling class. Seleucus was the only one of the successors not to immediately drop his Persian-born wife when he got the chance. Their eldest son Antiochus was born around the turn of 324 to 323 BCE. Antiochus I was in the east when his father died, as he'd been granted co-monarch status in the east some years earlier. He rushed over to the west when he heard the news of Seleucus's passing. However, he wasn't in time to prevent Macedon from slipping out of his grasp. After a revolving door of monarchs, the kingdom would eventually fall into the hands of Antigonus's grandson Antigonus II. Antiochus's next real challenge was an invasion of Anatolia by the Gauls. They had overrun Macedon and succeeded in killing Ptolemy Caraunus when he tried to sally out against them. Antiochus would succeed in defeating them in battle, earning the nickname Soter in the process. However, the Gauls would eventually settle in central Anatolia in a region that would come to be known as Galatia. Egypt was also a prominent player in the reign of Antiochus I. The First Syrian War broke out in the 270s BCE, perhaps prompted by tensions over a region called Hollow Syria, and the fact that Antiochus I had been supporting Ptolemy II's half-brother Magas, who was scheming against him from Cyrenaica. This war was a defeat for Antiochus I, although probably not a severe one. What the war probably did do was prompt him to raise his own son Seleucus to the imperial diadem as a co-monarch in the east. The younger Seleucus was born in about 293 BCE, so was still a young man when he became co-king. However, he eventually rebelled against his father and was put to death on his orders in about 266 BCE. This left only the younger son, Antiochus, as heir. Antiochus I died in Anatolia after squaring off against Pergamon. This meant the throne passed to the third generation, in the form of Antiochus II. Either he or his father is mentioned in the Edict of Ashoka. This new Antiochus had married his cousin Laodike, the daughter of his father's brother Achaeus. This marriage happened sometime before his accession in 261 BCE. The early part of his reign is primarily concerned with the Second Syrian War. We've discussed previously how this started due to competing claims over Anatolian cities. During the fighting, Ptolemy II initially travelled north into Syria, maybe attempting to profit off a false Seleucus the Young king rising up in Babylon. Antiochus II repulsed Ptolemy in Syria and found success in the Western theatre. Ptolemy might have been struggling with money problems as the war came to a close, and both sides seem to have been looking for a way out. Ptolemy II appears to have given back Cilicia and Pamphylia, and the Eleutheros River was once again established as the boundary between the two states, as it had been decades earlier under Seleucus I and Ptolemy I. After the Second Syrian War, Antiochus married Ptolemy's daughter. This was Berenike Syra. He took up with her and had a son called Antiochus. His wife Laodike I and her sons Seleucus and Antiochus Hyrax travelled west to Ephesus. It's not clear if Antiochus II fully separated from her, but at some point he travelled westwards to go back to his wife. While there, he died in 246 BCE, during the same year that Ptolemy II died. Differing accounts say that he either died from illness or else that Laodike had him poisoned. After Antiochus died, Seleucus II and his half-brother Antiochus the Younger were simultaneously declared as kings. Strategic assassination prevented Berenike and her son being an issue for very long, but an incursion from Ptolemy III posed more problems. This new Ptolemy rampaged through the centre of the empire, all while Seleucus II saw his fleet get destroyed. He did manage to get an army together and push Ptolemy back, but he was defeated in Palestine. When a peace was brokered, the terms included Seleucia in Pieria, Antioch's port, being handed over to the Ptolemies. This city is also where the early Seleucid monarchs were buried. Not a great look. The 2 decades of Seleucus II's reign are essentially one big firefighting spree. He had made his full brother Antiochus Hyrax a co-king in Anatolia, but as soon as the threat of Ptolemy III was gone, Hyrax rebelled against the throne. Seleucus brought his forces into Anatolia, but was defeated at Ancyra and forced to recognize Hyrax's control over all of Asia Minor. During the battle, it was even thought for a while that Seleucus II had died, to give you an idea of the gravity of the situation. After the Seleucid retreat, Anatolia would descend into chaos, before Attalus I of Pergamon began scooping up these former territories. Seleucus then tried to move eastwards and re-establish his authority in the eastern provinces. Parthia and Bactria had been moving towards independence, and Parthia had been overrun by the Parnae under Arsaces I. Seleucus moved in and pushed the Parnae back, but was eventually forced to retreat due to problems in the west calling for his attention. Western problems in his later reign included a rebellion by his aunt Stratonike, after she came home from Macedon and had her proposal rejected by her nephew. She tried to run away to Egypt but was killed before she could reach the Ptolemies. Added to this, the city of Babylon rebelled, which was probably connected to the unrest Stratonike had stirred up. Hyrax also tried to invade Seleucid territory before finally being evicted. He was ultimately killed by Thracian Gauls, after jumping from territory to territory and having to run away every time. Seleucus II died after falling off his horse in 225 BCE. He had been getting ready to invade Anatolia and take the fight to Attalus I of Pergamon. This struggle was taken up by his son, the new king Seleucus III. Seleucus III travelled into Anatolia and made it as far as Phrygia, but he was killed by a plot led by Nicanor and Apatorius. With that, the closest remaining Seleucid was Antiochus, the dead king's brother. He had been in Babylon ever since the problems in that city in the middle of the 230s BCE. Seleucus III appears to have made him co-monarch in the east, and now he was the only son of Seleucus II left standing. That brings us back up to speed. Next time, we'll see how Prince Antiochus gets on after the reins of power are thrust abruptly into his hands. Until then, thank you all for listening. Feel free to get in touch at the show's email address for any questions or comments. Until next time, have a great week, everyone.